She had no idea that the spare key she handed my brother on a Sunday afternoon in March, the one she'd kept, without my full knowledge, since the week I moved in, just in case, opened the door to a house whose deed had been quietly re-recorded 8 months earlier, under a name she had never bothered to learn, because she had never once asked what I changed when I got married, and had simply assumed, the way she assumed most things about my life, that nothing about me had actually changed at all. My mother gave my brother the keys to my house. She told him it was practically his anyway, since I'd always been generous, and he was going through a rough patch. He moved in while I was at a work conference in Seattle. He did not know, and neither did she, that the locks he was standing inside of belonged to a woman whose legal name, on every document that mattered, was no longer the one either of them had grown up calling her. And that the mismatch between the name on his moving boxes and the name on the county recorder's website was about to become the least convenient detail of his entire week. This is the story of what happens when a family assumes a daughter's life will always belong to whoever in the family needs it most. My name is Bridget Calloway-Nasser. I am 34 years old. I am a senior compliance officer at a regional bank in Columbus, Ohio, where I have worked for 9 years, the last 4 in a role specifically focused on identity verification protocols, fraud detection, and the regulatory requirements around establishing and confirming legal ownership of financial and real property assets. My professional life consists, in large part, of confirming that the person claiming an asset actually is the person legally entitled to it, and understanding, with a precision most people never have occasion to develop, exactly how thin the margin is between everyone assumes this is fine, and this is not, in fact, legally fine at all. I tell you my profession first because it is the entire reason this story resolved the way it did, and because the specific irony of what happened to me. A woman whose career is built on verifying identity and ownership, having her own identity and ownership casually overridden by her own mother, is not lost on me, even now, even months later. My mother is named Carol Calloway. She is 63 years old, retired from a long career as a dental hygienist, and she is, in most respects that matter to ordinary daily life, a loving and well-intentioned woman. I want to establish that clearly before I describe what she did, because the simplest version of this story would render her a villain from the first sentence. And that version, while containing real and serious harm, misses the specific texture of how a person can cause genuine damage while operating, the entire time from a place she would describe, and probably believe, as love. My brother is named Patrick Calloway. He is 37 years old, 3 years older than me, and he has spent the better part of the last decade in a pattern that I have watched my mother describe, repeatedly, and with increasing strain in her own voice, even as she continues to use the phrase, as going through a rough patch. A phrase that has, over 10 years, covered 2 failed business ventures, 3 jobs lost under circumstances that were never fully explained to me, a divorce, and a recurring need for financial intervention from our mother, that has, by my own rough calculation based on conversations I was occasionally looped into, exceeded $80,000 across the past decade. I do not say this to be cruel about my brother. I say it because it is the necessary context for understanding why my mother did what she did, and why she believed, with what I genuinely think was sincere conviction, that what she was doing was reasonable. I married my husband, Tariq Nasser, 2 years before the events of this story. We met through mutual friends in Columbus, where he works as a civil engineer for a municipal infrastructure firm, and we married in a small ceremony that my mother attended, that my brother attended, and that involved, as part of the standard legal process of marriage, my formal name changed from Bridget Calloway to Bridget Calloway-Nasser. A hyphenated name I chose specifically because I did not want to fully relinquish the name I had built my professional reputation under, while also wanting to formally and legally join my name with my husband's. I want to be precise about something here, because it matters enormously to what follows. I told my mother about this name change. I told her in person, at the wedding reception, when she asked what I planned to do about my name. I told her again, 6 months later, when I changed my driver's license, my passport, my professional licensing documentation at the bank, and every financial account I held. I mentioned it, in passing, on multiple occasions over the following year and a half, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that adult children mention administrative details of their lives to their parents. Not as an announcement requiring special attention, but as a simple fact woven into ordinary conversation. My mother, by her own later admission, had simply never retained it. She continued to refer to me, in conversation with friends and with Patrick, and in her own phone contacts, as Bridget Calloway, the name she had known me by for 32 years before the wedding, and the specific cognitive habit of decades apparently proved more durable, in her mind, than any number of times I had mentioned the change. This detail, her simple failure to retain information about a legal change in my identity, would become, 8 months later, the single most consequential gap in her understanding of my life that she had ever allowed herself to maintain. The house at the center of this story is a 3-bedroom Craftsman in the Clintonville neighborhood of Columbus, which Tariq and I purchased 14 months before the events of this story. 8 months after our wedding. We purchased it jointly, with both our names on the mortgage, and, critically, both our names on the deed. Recorded with the Franklin County Recorder's Office under the names Bridget Calloway-Nasser and Tariq Nasser, reflecting my legal name at the time of purchase, which was, by that point, already my married name. I had not specifically informed my mother of the closing date, the address, or the precise legal details of the purchase, beyond mentioning, in a general way over a holiday dinner, that Tariq and I had bought a house in Clintonville and were excited about it. This was not secrecy on my part. It was simply the ordinary pace at which adult children share housing details with parents who live 40 minutes away and see them perhaps once a month. Information shared in broad strokes, with the specific administrative particulars assumed to be available if anyone asked for them, which no one, in this case, ever did. My mother had visited the house twice in the 14 months we had owned it. She had complimented the kitchen renovation we completed shortly after moving in. She had never asked to see the deed, had never asked whose names appeared on it, and had never, as far as I am aware, had any reason to think about the deed at all. Because the deed is not the kind of document that ordinarily enters casual family conversation, even in families considerably more organized about property matters than mine had ever been. I want to plant 2 details here that will matter significantly to what follows. The first, approximately 2 years before the events of this story, before Tariq and I were even married, while I was still living in a rental apartment in Columbus, and Patrick was navigating one of his recurring financial crises, this one involving the collapse of a small landscaping business he had attempted to start. My mother had asked me, directly, whether I would be willing to let Patrick stay with me for a few weeks while he got back on his feet. I had said no. I had said no clearly, with specific reasons that I articulated at the time and that I want to record here because they establish a pattern that predates the house entirely. Patrick and I had a difficult relationship, shaped by years of watching him receive financial bailouts that I had never received and was never offered, despite navigating my own 20s with considerably less family financial support and considerably more independent effort to establish my career. I did not trust that a few weeks would remain a few weeks, based on prior experience with exactly this kind of arrangement extended to other family members. And I did not believe, based on years of observation, that Patrick's financial difficulties stemmed primarily from bad luck rather than from a pattern of decisions he had not yet meaningfully examined. My mother had been disappointed by my refusal. She had used the specific phrase, at the time, "I just don't understand why you can't be more generous with your own brother," a phrase she would return to, almost verbatim, 8 months before the events at the center of this story. The second detail. When Tariq and I purchased the Clintonville house, we changed the locks immediately upon closing. A standard, sensible practice that any homebuyer should follow, given that a house's prior owners and any number of prior key holders cannot be reliably tracked or trusted. We did not at that time provide a spare key to my mother. We provided one to Tariq's sister, who lived nearby and who we trusted for emergency access, and we kept a backup in a lockbox at the house itself. What I did not know, what I would not learn until the specific crisis at the center of this story unfolded, was that my mother had, on one of her 2 visits to the house, while I was occupied elsewhere in conversation with Tariq, taken note of the lockbox's location on the back porch, and, through a conversation with the lockbox's prior owner, the seller's elderly mother, whom Carol had apparently struck up an unrelated friendly conversation with, at a neighborhood event months earlier, learned the lockbox's default code, which we had never changed, because we had not realized, at the time, that the code's existence was known to anyone outside our immediate household. I want to be honest. This detail, when I eventually learned it, struck me as almost absurdly improbable. The specific coincidence of my mother befriending, entirely independently of anything related to me, an elderly woman who happened to know the lockbox code to my own house. But Columbus is, in the specific way mid-sized cities often are, smaller than it appears. And the coincidence, however improbable, was simply true, confirmed later, through a conversation I had directly with the elderly woman in question, who was mortified to learn what her casual mention of a 4-digit code had eventually enabled. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that exists in the gap between what a family member believes they know about your life, and what is actually, legally, currently true. The gap does not announce itself. It simply sits there, unexamined, until something forces it into the light. And by the time it is forced into the light, the assumptions built on top of the gap have often already done real damage. Patrick's most recent crisis began in January, when his most recent job, a sales position at a regional logistics company that he had held for just under a year, ended, according to his own account relayed through our mother, due to company restructuring. Though I later learned, through a mutual acquaintance who still worked at the company, that the actual circumstances involved a performance issue that had been managed, internally, for several months before the termination. He had been staying with our mother since January, in the house in Westerville, where she had lived since our childhood, an arrangement that had, by March, begun generating the specific friction that occurs when a 63-year-old woman who had been enjoying a quiet, independent retirement finds her home suddenly occupied by an adult son, navigating an extended crisis, with all the attendant disruption to her routine, her space, and her own retirement budget. Given that Patrick was not, during this period, contributing meaningfully to household expenses, my mother called me in early March, in a conversation I remember with specific clarity because of how it began. "I need to talk to you about Patrick," she said. "He's been with me for 2 months now, and honestly, Bridget, it's becoming a lot. I love having him here, but I'm 63, and I had finally gotten used to my own quiet life, and I think it would actually be good for both of us if he had his own space again." "I agree," I said. "What's he planning?" "Well," she said, with the specific careful tone I had learned, over 34 years, to recognize as the precursor to a request I would not like. "I had an idea, and I wanted to run it by you before I said anything definite to him." "Okay," I said. "You and Tariq have that big house in Clintonville," she said. 3 bedrooms, and it's just the 2 of you." I thought, what if Patrick stayed with you 2 for a little while? Just until he gets back on his feet. You have so much more space than I do. And honestly, sweetheart, you've always been so much more financially stable than your brother. I think it would really help him to be around your example for a bit. I want to describe my reaction to this honestly. I was not surprised, exactly, given the prior request 2 years earlier, but I was struck by the specific casualness with which my mother had escalated from, "Would you consider," to a fully formed plan she had apparently already begun mentally implementing, evidenced by what she said next. "I haven't told him yet," she continued, "but I wanted to let you know that I think this would really be the best solution, and I was hoping you'd be open to it." Mom, I said. I need you to hear me clearly. The answer is no, the same as it was 2 years ago, and for the same reasons. Patrick is not moving into my house. There was a pause on the line that carried, even through the phone, the specific texture of someone recalibrating a plan she had already substantially committed to in her own mind. I think that's a little harsh, she said, eventually. He's your brother, Bridget. He's struggling. You and Tariq have so much, and it would genuinely just be temporary. I understand he's struggling, I said. I'm not unsympathetic to that. But my answer is still no. I need you to actually hear that and respect it, not just file it away as something to revisit later. She said she heard me. I did not, in retrospect, believe she actually had. I learned what happened next not from my mother and not from Patrick, but from a notification on my phone from the security system Tariq and I had installed at the Clintonville house. A different system than the one in the previous story I am reminded of. Though the underlying principle, I would later reflect with some dark amusement, was strikingly similar. Technology installed for one mundane purpose ending up as the critical evidence in a family crisis no one had anticipated. I was in Seattle for a 3-day banking compliance conference. A trip I had mentioned to my mother in our most recent conversation, specifically noting the dates I would be away. On the second day of the conference, during a session on emerging fraud detection methodologies, an irony I have had considerable time to appreciate since, my phone buzzed with a notification. Motion detected at the front entrance, followed, within minutes, by a second notification, indicating the door had been unlocked using the correct code, followed by a live feed showing my brother, accompanied by 2 moving boxes and a duffel bag, standing in my living room. I stepped out of the conference session into the hallway, my hands not entirely steady, and called Tariq, who was at work in Columbus and had not yet seen the notifications. Patrick is in our house, I said, right now, with moving boxes. There was a brief, stunned silence on Tariq's end. How did he get in? I don't know yet, I said. But he's there. I'm watching the live feed right now. I called my mother next. She answered with a tone of breezy, almost cheerful normalcy that told me, immediately, exactly what had happened and exactly how she had justified it to herself in the days since our conversation. Mom, I said, Patrick is at my house, right now, with moving boxes. Oh. Yes, she said. I gave him the spare key. Bridget, I know you said no, but I really thought about it, and I think this is the right thing for the family. He needed somewhere to go, and you have so much space, and I made the decision. I know you'll be upset at first, but I really think once you see how it goes, you'll understand. You gave him a key to my house, I said. After I told you directly that the answer was no, I gave him the spare, she said, with the specific defensive precision of someone who had clearly rehearsed this explanation. The one from the lockbox. I got the code from Eleanor, your neighbor, ages ago, just in case of an emergency, and I decided this counted as an emergency. He needed somewhere stable, Bridget, and you weren't even using all that space. I stood in a hotel hallway in Seattle, 3 days into a work trip, processing the fact that my mother had been quietly aware of my home's lockbox code for an unspecified period of time, had decided unilaterally to override a direct and explicit refusal I had given her days earlier, and had facilitated my brother moving boxes into my house while I was 1,000 miles away. He needs to leave, I said. Today. Right now. Bridget, please don't be like this, my mother said. He just got settled in. Can't we at least let him stay through the weekend while you're traveling anyway? You won't even be home to be inconvenienced by it. I did not respond to that immediately, because I needed a moment to process the specific quality of the logic my mother had just offered. That my own absence from my own house somehow made its unauthorized occupation by my brother more reasonable rather than less. I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said. I am calling Tariq right now. He is going to handle this today while I finish my conference, and I expect Patrick to be gone with all of his belongings by the time I land tomorrow evening. You're being unreasonable, my mother said. No, I said. I am being entirely reasonable. What's unreasonable is giving someone a key to a house you do not own, after the person who does own it told you explicitly not to. I called Tariq back and explained the full situation. He was understandably furious, not at me, but at the specific violation of having his own home entered and occupied without his knowledge or consent, by a person he had a cordial but not close relationship with, facilitated by a mother-in-law who had apparently been holding onto his home's access code for an unknown period of time. "I'm going over there," Tariq said. "Right now after work, I want him out today. I want to handle this carefully," I said. "I don't want this to become a screaming match at the front door. I want it handled the way I'd handle any unauthorized occupant. Clearly, with the legal facts established up front, so there's no ambiguity about what's actually happening. This is the moment where my professional training became directly, personally relevant in a way I had never anticipated it needing to be. "Tariq," I said, "pull the deed, the actual recorded deed, the PDF we have saved from the closing. I want you to have it with you when you go." "Why does the deed matter for getting him to leave?" Tariq asked. "He's not claiming ownership, he's just squatting, basically, because your mom told him it was fine. Because my mother is going to keep insisting, this is a family matter that should be worked out informally, the way she's already started doing on the phone with me," I said. "And the moment this becomes informal, it becomes a negotiation about feelings and fairness and Patrick's struggles, which is exactly the terrain my mother is most comfortable on, and exactly the terrain where she's most likely to wear us down. I want this to be, immediately and unambiguously, about what it actually is. An unauthorized occupant of a privately owned residence, with documentation establishing exactly who owns it, and exactly why he has no standing to be there." Tariq was quiet for a moment. "You think she's going to fight us on this?" "I think my mother has spent 10 years believing that family obligation overrides legal and personal boundaries whenever Patrick is involved," I said. "I think she is about to find out very specifically that it doesn't. But I want that lesson delivered through documentation, not through a yelling match that she can later recharacterize as me being cruel to my struggling brother." Tariq arrived at the Clintonville house at 6 that evening with the printed deed in hand, along with a printed copy of our marriage certificate and my updated driver's license, documents I had instructed him, over the phone from Seattle, to bring specifically and deliberately, because I understood, with the specific clarity of someone who verifies legal identity documentation for a living, exactly what category of confusion was about to need correcting. Patrick answered the door. According to Tariq's account afterward, he seemed genuinely surprised to see him, which suggested, accurately, as it turned out, that our mother had presented the arrangement to Patrick with considerably more confidence and certainty than the actual situation warranted. "Hey, man," Patrick said. "I figured Bridget would have told you I was staying for a bit. Mom said it was all set." "It's not all set," Tariq said. "You need to leave, tonight." Patrick's expression shifted toward the specific defensive confusion of someone whose understanding of events did not match what he was now being told. "Mom said this was fine. She said Bridget agreed it made sense, given how much space you guys have." "Bridget did not agree," Tariq said. "Bridget said no, directly twice, and is currently in Seattle finding out, through a security camera notification, that you're standing in our living room." Patrick looked, by Tariq's account, genuinely uncertain for the first time in the conversation. The specific look of a man realizing that the family narrative he had been operating inside of, for the past several days, might not match the actual facts on the ground. "I want to show you something," Tariq said, and produced the printed deed. He explained it the way I had walked him through it on the phone. The property was owned jointly by Tariq Nasser and Bridget Calloway-Nasser, as recorded with Franklin County. He pointed to the name. He explained, patiently, that this was not simply Bridget's maiden name with a hyphen added casually, but the legal name under which the property was actually titled, the name that appeared on the mortgage, the insurance policy, the property tax records, and every other document establishing ownership. "Your mother," Tariq said, "may have told you this house belonged to Bridget Calloway. I want you to understand that the woman who owns this house, legally, is Bridget Calloway-Nasser. Carol may not have realized that distinction matters. It matters enormously. It means that any authorization she believed she was giving you, based on her understanding of who owns this house and what claim she might have to speak for that person, was based on an inaccurate premise from the start. Patrick, according to Tariq, looked at the deed for a long moment. Mom said it was basically still your guys' family house, he said slowly. Since Bridget grew up. I don't even know what she meant by that, honestly, now that you're saying it out loud. I don't think she meant anything coherent, Tariq said. I think she meant that Bridget is her daughter, and therefore anything Bridget has access to is something Carol believes she has some standing over. That's not how property law works. It's also not how basic respect for another adult's home works. But the property law part is the part I actually need you to understand tonight, because it's the part that determines what happens if you don't leave. What happens if I don't leave? Patrick said. Then this becomes a police matter, Tariq said. Criminal trespass. You were given access by someone with no legal authority to grant it, and you've been informed, directly, by the actual legal owner's husband, that you do not have permission to be here. If you choose to stay after this conversation, I will call the Columbus Police Department and report an unauthorized occupant. I do not want to do that. I would much rather you simply pack your things and go tonight, while this is still a family disagreement and not a police report. Patrick, to his credit, and I want to note this credit specifically, because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolded, did not argue further. He packed his 2 boxes and his duffel bag, the same ones he had arrived with, and left within the hour. Tariq told me later that the conversation had ended with Patrick saying quietly, almost to himself rather than to Tariq directly, I should have asked Bridget myself instead of just believing Mom. That sentence, when Tariq relayed it to me, was the first indication I had that my brother's role in this entire episode was somewhat more complicated than simple entitled imposition, that he had, in some sense, also been managed by our mother's specific gift for presenting a plan, as already settled and agreed upon, in a way that made the people on the receiving end of the plan less likely to question its actual foundations. There is a particular kind of family manipulation that does not require the manipulator to be lying, exactly, in any single statement. It requires only the confident presentation of an unverified assumption as settled fact, repeated to multiple people separately, so that each person believes the others have already agreed. And no one thinks to check whether the underlying agreement actually exists. My mother called me again that evening, once Patrick had presumably reported back to her about what had happened. You sent Tariq over there to threaten your own brother with the police, she said. Her voice carried a specific, wounded outrage that struck me, even through my own continued frustration, as genuinely felt rather than performed. She appeared to actually believe, in that moment, that she was the wronged party in this exchange. I sent my husband to remove an unauthorized occupant from our home, I said. That occupant happened to be my brother, which makes it more painful than it would otherwise be, but it does not change what it actually was. He's family, my mother said. You don't call the police on family. You don't give someone a key to a house you don't own, after the actual owner told you explicitly not to, I said. I need you to actually sit with that, Mom, instead of continuing to reframe this as me being unreasonably harsh toward Patrick. This isn't about Patrick's character, or his struggles, or whether he deserves help. This is about you making a unilateral decision about my property, against my explicit wishes, because you've decided that being my mother gives you some standing over decisions that are not actually yours to make. There was a long silence on the line. I didn't think of it that way, she said, eventually, in a voice considerably smaller than the wounded outrage she had opened the call with. I know you didn't, I said. That's actually the core problem. You didn't think of it that way because you've spent so long believing that family obligation overrides individual ownership and individual boundaries, especially where Patrick is concerned, that it didn't occur to you to examine whether what you were doing was actually yours to do. I know about the name, she said after another pause. Tariq mentioned something about the deed, the name on it, Bridget Calloway-Nasser, I said. My legal name. The name on the deed, the mortgage, my driver's license, my passport, every account I hold. I've told you about this name change multiple times over the past 2 years, Mom. I'm not upset that you forgot a hyphenated name. I'm pointing out that the gap between what you assumed about my life and what's actually true was wide enough that you didn't even know, with accuracy, whose house you were granting access to. I just think of you as my Bridget, she said. Bridget Calloway, that's who you've always been to me. I understand that emotionally, I said. But emotionally is not how property law works, and it's not how respect for another adult's boundaries works either. I am also simultaneously Bridget Calloway-Nasser, homeowner who told you no, and that version of me is the one whose decision should have mattered here, regardless of which version feels more familiar to you. The weeks that followed involved a slow, occasionally painful recalibration of my relationship with both my mother and my brother. Not a single dramatic confrontation that resolved everything, but a series of smaller, more honest conversations that gradually established a different operating baseline for how decisions involving my life, my property, and my boundaries would be made going forward. Patrick called me directly, 3 days after the incident, in a conversation I had not necessarily expected him to initiate. I wanted to apologize myself, he said. Not just hear about it secondhand through Mom's version of things. I should have called you before I showed up. I let Mom's confidence about the plan stand in for actually checking with you, and that's on me, not just on her. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I also want to be honest, he said. Part of why I didn't call you is because I knew you'd say no, and I didn't want to hear it directly. It was easier to let Mom be the one managing it, so I could tell myself it was basically approved without actually facing you saying no to my face. This admission, more than anything else in the entire sequence of events, shifted my understanding of what had actually happened. Patrick had not simply been an entitled younger sibling barging into property that wasn't his. He had been, in his own way, avoiding an uncomfortable direct conversation by allowing our mother's confident mismanagement of the situation to do the difficult work of asking on his behalf. A dynamic I suspect had repeated itself, in various forms, across the prior decade of financial bailouts and family interventions, with our mother consistently positioning herself as the intermediary who made requests so that the person actually benefiting from them never had to risk a direct refusal. I think you and I have actually been managed by the same pattern for a long time, I said. Just from opposite sides of it. You get to avoid asking me directly and risking rejection. I get bypassed entirely, because Mom decides what I would agree to without checking, and then presents it to both of us as already settled. Patrick was quiet for a moment. That's a pretty accurate read, he said. Where are you staying now? I asked. Back at Mom's for now, he said. I'm actually looking at an apartment. A studio, nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I think I need that more than I needed somewhere bigger and free. I've been letting other people solve my problems for 10 years, and I don't think it's actually helped me solve anything. I do not know, as I tell this story, whether Patrick's specific insight in that conversation represents a lasting change or a temporary moment of clarity that will fade once the immediate discomfort of the incident passes. I have learned, over the prior decade of watching his pattern, to hold any optimism about his trajectory carefully, without either dismissing genuine progress or assuming it will automatically last. What I can say is that he did, in fact, move into that studio apartment within 6 weeks, has remained there since, and has called me twice in the month since, not for money, not for a favor, simply to talk, which is itself a category of contact between us that had not meaningfully existed in the years before. My mother's recalibration took longer and required more direct conversation than Patrick's did, which I attribute, in part, to the specific difficulty of a parent confronting the ways her parenting patterns have caused harm, as distinct from an adult child confronting his own avoidant behavior. We had a longer conversation, 3 weeks after the incident, at her kitchen table in Westerville, the same table where I had grown up doing homework, and where, decades later, she had apparently also decided, at some point I could not pinpoint precisely, that her access to my adult life and property remained as unrestricted as it had been when I was a child living under her roof. "I think I need to understand something," she said. "And I want you to be honest with me even if the honesty is hard to hear. Do you think I do this because I don't respect you, or because I respect Patrick's needs more than yours?" I considered the question carefully, because I wanted to answer it accurately, rather than simply in whatever way might feel most satisfying to say in the moment. "I think you do it because you've never fully separated, in your own mind, the version of me that needed you completely, as a child, from the version of me that exists now, as an adult with my own legal identity, my own property, and my own marriage," I said. "I think when you look at me, some part of you still sees the same Bridget Calloway who lived in this house and needed your permission for things. I think that part of you genuinely doesn't register that the actual current version of me, Bridget Calloway-Nasser, homeowner, married woman, professional, operates with an entirely different set of facts than the version you're picturing." "That's not about respect then," she said. "That's about not updating my picture of you." "I think it's both," I said. "I think the failure to update the picture is itself a form of disrespect, even if it doesn't feel like one from the inside. Updating your understanding of someone is part of actually respecting who they currently are, rather than who they used to be." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at her hands on the kitchen table. "I've been giving Patrick things for 10 years because I'm scared of what happens to him if I stop," she said, eventually. "I think some part of me believes that if I just keep solving the immediate crisis, eventually he'll land somewhere stable, and all the bailouts will have been worth it. I don't think I've ever actually examined whether that strategy is working, because examining it would mean admitting that maybe it's actually part of why he hasn't landed anywhere stable yet." "That's a much bigger question than just the house," I said. "But I think it's the right question to actually be asking." "And the house," she said. "I am sorry, Bridget. Not just generally sorry, the way I think I said it on the phone that night, but specifically sorry for the actual thing I did. I made a decision about your property, after you told me directly not to, because I decided my judgment about what was best for the family mattered more than your explicit answer. That was wrong, regardless of how I felt about Patrick's situation." "Thank you," I said. "That's the version of the apology I needed to hear. Will you forgive me?" she asked. "I already have, mostly," I said. "But forgiveness and a fully restored sense of trust aren't the same thing. I need some time to actually believe that the next time I say no to something, you'll hear it as final, rather than as an opening position you might still work around if you decide the cause is important enough." "That's fair," she said. "I'll earn that back. I understand it'll take time." In the month since, my mother has, in fact, demonstrated a meaningfully different pattern. She asked me directly before making any decision involving my house, my schedule, or my resources, rather than deciding unilaterally and informing me afterward. When Patrick needed help with the security deposit for his studio apartment, she called me to discuss whether I thought it was a good idea before she committed to it, rather than simply committing and explaining it to me later as a settled fact. A small shift, but one that represented, in its own modest way, the specific recalibration I had needed to see. She has also, with what I genuinely believe is sincere effort, begun referring to me by my full married name in conversation, with the specific deliberate care of someone correcting a decades-old habit through conscious repetition rather than natural retention. She still occasionally slips, defaulting to Bridget Calloway out of the sheer muscle memory of 34 years, and corrects herself when she notices, which I have come to find, oddly, more meaningful than if she had simply gotten it perfectly right from the start. The visible effort of correction mattering more, in its way, than effortless accuracy would have. I changed the lockbox code the day I returned from Seattle. I also, at Tariq's suggestion, had a brief, direct conversation with Eleanor, our elderly neighbor, explaining gently what had happened, and asking her not to share any future codes or access details with anyone, regardless of how friendly or trustworthy the request seemed. Eleanor was mortified, as I mentioned, and has been, since that conversation, scrupulously careful about exactly this kind of information. A small repair to a small but consequential gap in our home's actual security perimeter. I think often about the specific moment in the hotel hallway in Seattle, watching a live security feed of my brother standing in my living room with moving boxes, and about how completely the entire crisis had been built on a foundation that was, in the most literal legal sense, simply inaccurate. My mother's belief that the house and the woman who owned it were both still operating under names and arrangements that had not actually been true for over a year. I think about how differently the entire situation might have unfolded if I had been less careful, 2 years earlier, about formally and thoroughly updating every document that established my legal identity. If Tariq and I had been less deliberate about how the deed was titled, if I had simply let the property default to whatever name felt convenient in the moment, rather than ensuring it accurately reflected who I had legally become, the precision mattered. It always matters, in ways that frequently go unnoticed until the exact day they become the only thing standing between an ordinary family conflict and a fully legitimized, undisputed claim to your own front door. Identity is not simply a feeling you carry about yourself. It is also, simultaneously, a specific set of facts recorded in specific places. A deed, a license, a marriage certificate, and the gap between how your family perceives you and what is actually legally true about you is a gap that someone, eventually, will try to operate inside of, whether they intend any harm by it or not. The precision you maintain in your own records is not bureaucratic excess. It is the structure that holds when someone else's assumptions do not. And that was the year I understood that my mother had never stopped seeing me as the version of myself that needed her permission for things. And that the only way to actually change that perception was not through argument or hurt feelings, but through the simple, unglamorous, durable fact of documentation. A deed with the correct name on it, a husband who knew exactly which papers to bring to a difficult conversation, and a woman who had spent years building a professional life around the precise unsentimental principle that ownership is established by the record, not by who feels, emotionally, like they ought to have a say. My mother gave my brother a key. The key opened a door, but the door belonged to Bridget Calloway-Nasser, a woman my mother had not yet finished learning to see. And the record, when it finally mattered, knew exactly who that was, even when she did not.